We are now coming to the second part of this morning, and we will have our next speaker. It's Professor Jörg Matthes. He holds actually an assistant professorship for political communication and political behavior with the NCCR Democracy. I think you heard on the first day from Professor Kriesi what this is. And he will tell us something about the volatility of public behavior. So how mass media can influence the public opinion. And you can see here his title, Mass Media and Public Opinion, Manipulating or Enlightening. Welcome, Professor Jörg Matthes, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much for this kind introduction, and of course, thanks very much for having me here in this wonderful venue at this wonderful place. And it's really great to be here and to talk about my research and the research we are doing in the NCCR Democracy, a huge research network at the University of Zurich. Klaus Hug opened the conference yesterday by taking us back to the ancient times of Greece, of Pericles, where he told us that in those ancient times only young men fit for military service were allowed to vote in those times. And of course, nowadays we are very far away from such rules. Everybody is of course allowed to vote, and everybody is allowed to make a decision in a democracy, and we all would perfectly agree that this is a very good thing, and this is something that is very common and very basic and cannot be questioned. However, if we have this right for everyone to vote, the question, of course, arises, what kind of citizens do we want in a democracy? So what are the traits and the characteristics of people that are allowed to vote in our democracy? We also learned in the podium discussion yesterday that democracy is about to follow the will of the people. So if we follow the will of the people, of course we must somehow trust in the capacity of individuals to form judgments fit for democracy, democratic judgments that are useful, that are right, that will lead us the way that is good for the country and good for the world. So generally what we expect from democratic citizens is that they should form opinions and make choices that somehow reflect their true feelings and true attitudes. So if we follow the will of the people, there must be a will of the people actually that we can follow. And if people really think this is an important issue, this is an important problem, we have to take this serious in a democracy. That's what the whole idea is all about. So at the same time, this actually means that citizens' opinions should not be completely arbitrary. They should be based on some amount of information. There should be some kind of rationality. They should not be fully rational, but there should be some kind of rationality in those opinions that we can trust those opinions for the good of our society. So, and we're talking about that, of course, the question arises, what's the role of the mass media here? Can the mass media orchestrate or easily manipulate the will of the people so that in the end we are talking about probably not following the will of the people but following the will of the mass media? So we have to ask the question, can the will of the people be strongly shaped by mass media reports? And this is a question that there's a lot of research on that, there are huge debates on that in many fields in the social sciences, and I'd like to give you some excerpts of the research I have been doing in the NCCR Democracy at the University of Zurich. Of course, we all agree that most information we have in our minds and most of the things that people know about the political and the social world is somehow shaped by the mass media. It's really, to follow politics means to follow the mass media. There are different formats, as for instance the national television news shows, quite important, or the daily newspaper that people follow, that people learn about politics, or even more entertainment-oriented formats like entertainment shows in which politicians appear and talk about themselves, but also talk about their policies, like in Switzerland, Jacobo and Müller, or even more prominently, political discussion shows we also have here in Switzerland, which are really important for the opinion decision-making process for the whole public. And what we have in many countries all over the world is presidential debates between presidential candidates. This is a very prominent feature and is theorized to be a very important feature of the mass media to shape opinions. And by the way, we not only have that in the huge Western countries, but also in countries like, for instance, Iran. There were presidential debates, although most of us would not expect that in a country where we are rather critical about its democratic core values. So, as you can see, there are a lot of different sources where people can learn about politics, where people can learn about what's going on in the real world. And the question is, of course, how strong is this influence from the mass media on people's thinking and opinions? So when discussing about this issue, there are basically two different kinds of views, and Hans-Peter Grisi yesterday also touched those different kinds of views already by saying that, okay, there's one more positive scenario and one more negative scenario, and you have, of course, opponents on both sides arguing with different kinds of perspectives. Some scholars say that when we're talking about mass media, this is some kind of citizen manipulation. That means that when we look at the studies, we find strong media effects. The mass media dictates and orchestrates public opinion, and we see that citizens can be easily swayed from one direction to the other. Citizens can be influenced, and there are many examples in history where this could be observed. Others say, would argue from a different perspective and say, no, I wouldn't speak of a manipulation here, it's rather a citizen enlightenment when it comes to the mass media. That means that mass media have more or less some kind of limited effects on opinions, and what the mass media does, it provides citizens with basic information they need, and when citizens end up deciding in a democratic vote, for instance, of course they consider this information, but they will always decide based on their true predispositions, on their true feelings and opinions, and that's why, although the information is considered, most people will not be influenced by mass media reports. So there are actually two sides to this issue, and I'd like to give you a small excerpt of my research in trying to answering these questions, or trying to take a position between those two sides here. I'd like to do that from a scientific paradigm, which is called the framing paradigm, or framing research, which is one of the major concepts we have in political communication research. And the key idea of this framing idea is that political issues are often ambiguous, and they are subject to different interpretations or perspectives. That means when we talk about a social or political issue, there are always several considerations that we could have, always several arguments going on, and what we usually get is a frame of some of those arguments, and some political actors or some elites, they just frame the issue with some arguments, and others frame the issue with different arguments. They have a different view on the issue. So what we would say in political communication scholarship is that political elites suggest issue interpretations. They interpret the world, political issues for us, and they do that by highlighting some facts that they say are important facts and neglecting other facts. I will have an example for that in a minute. So we have selective ways of treating issues, of viewing upon the world. So what the news media now do is they are confronted with these elite frames by political actors, and they themselves select those frames and modify those frames and make their news media reports and possibly bring in own frames, own ideas, own arguments that were not suggested by political elites. And when we have this in mind, the key question is, of course, what happens if the mass media select some facts over others, confronts us with some frames, exposes the citizenship to some frames, and these frames highlight some information, some arguments, so the public is confronted with some arguments, and when finally the public is asked to decide on a political issue, these arguments are more likely to be used in forming opinions. That's the basic idea here. So when I repeatedly say to you that there is a big threat of the swine flu, for instance, and I repeat all those arguments in favor of this perspective, and we all know there are different other arguments not in favor of this perspective, but if I repeatedly invoke all those arguments in favor of this perspective that there's a danger and there's a threat because of the swine flu, and then ask people about their opinions, they use this information conveyed by the mass media to form their opinions, and they will probably end up with an opinion, oh, we have to change something about that, this is a problem we have here, and this is negative. So that's how the public opinion formation process in a nutshell works. The mass media highlights information, people use this information in forming their judgments, and of course, if different information is highlighted, different judgments might follow. Look, for instance, at the issue of biotechnology or green genetically modified food. You have some articles in the news media arguing that, it's in German, that, genetically modified food is not at all unhealthy. In contrast, it's pretty healthy because it is modified. Other newspaper articles arguing that if genetically modified food is tested scientifically, there's no harm, there's no threat, there's no danger at all. Or one could argue that, think about it, if we have genetically modified food, this is a good tool to fight world hunger, starvation all over the world. So this is one way of seeing this issue, one frame about this issue, so to speak. On the other hand, you have newspaper articles taking a completely different perspective, highlighting completely different facts, framing the issue in a completely different way, arguing that, these genetically modified foods, are they really completely unharmful? Is it really true? Do we really know that? Or saying that, as far as we know, the risks are, we don't really know about those risks. And what we are doing here, we are opening in a Pandora's box. We cannot know what will happen, but it is very likely that something bad will happen. Or making news reports about social movements that have a very basic or emotional approach to this issue, and giving the voice to those movements that say, okay, it's poison, and people are poisoned by genetically modified foods. So this is the idea we have in framing research. Elites suggest different frames, the news media select different frames, report about those frames. We also can find this, of course, in political advertising or political campaigns. This is the famous example I don't need to explain here, but of course, now we also could talk about the impact of emotions in decision making, but nevertheless, there's also an argument conveyed here, a certain information that is highlighted, and this is the information that there is a threat that too many foreigners will probably change our culture here in Switzerland, and will do that in a harmful way. This is an argument conveyed by this political advertisement. On the other hand, you could have a different frame on that issue. You could say, when we talk about immigration or when we talk about Islam in the country, it's not about a threat of being overwhelmed by different cultures or by different religions. The most important argument about this issue is freedom of religion. So here we have an advertisement saying the heaven over Switzerland is big enough for all religions. When we talk about this issue, we should be talking about freedom of religion. Completely different frame. So what you see here is a basic picture of the whole framing process. Frames are suggested by political elites, by parties, but also by spin doctors, by groups that try to influence public opinion before the background of our culture, our society. That actually means that only those frames are suggested that make somehow sense within our culture, in our country we live in. So the elites suggest those frames, the news media take those frames, modify them, select them, and report about those different perspectives. And this is now the crucial point. It is probably not possible to report about all different frames and all different perspectives that we have in the real world. They usually select some frames, they focus on some frames. We could also discuss about if these frames are elite frames suggested by the government or other frames. So there's a selection process going on here. Frames are modified, selected, news frames are brought in, and then the public follows news media coverage and forms opinion about those issues based on the information that is conveyed through the news media. This is a quite simple picture, of course. one might say this is quite trivial, but there are two things here that are noteworthy and important. First of all, there's always a competition of frames going on at all stages of this process. This means that also political elites have a competition of frames. Of course, they know what other parties are going to suggest. They adjust their framing strategies to that, and they try to have the best and most convincing frames that they convey to the news media. But also in the news media, there's a competition over frames. You have some journalists more liking to focus on other aspects than different journalists. So there's also competition, and you have different frames in one single news story by journalists saying, look, here's the issue of biotech. One say positive, others say negative. So we also have these kind of reports and a frame competition. And finally, within the public, we also have the idea of frame competition. Some people say, no, I'm pro, and some say, I'm against this referendum or this template. Second, this is quite important, the news media also observes not only the political actors, but also the public. They have used data, public opinion data, they conduct interviews with single exemplars, single people on the street, and this gives some kind of feeling, what does the public think about this issue? And this is an important information that is also observed by political elites, and as a consequence to that, political elites can adjust their frames, change their framing strategies, suggest new frames, suggest new arguments, and try to react in a way that makes them successful in a political campaign. So it's a quite dynamic process evolving over time. The key of the basic idea of my research, or my main interest, is the idea of framing effect. So I'm more on this side of research here. I'm interested in how strong is the influence of news media reports on public opinion. And what I'd like to do, I'd like to give you a snapshot of my research. And my research is basically, it's based on two quite simple premises. That's my theoretical approach. First of all, we always talk about the citizens. We're talking about the public, what the public wants, how the public is. But I think we would all agree that the public is quite different. And people are quite different, citizens are different. And when we try to explain media effects, we have to take this information into account. Some citizens hold very strong opinions. They are partisans. They are very sure in what they think. They're certain in their opinions, have a high certainty of what they say. So they hold strong predispositions. And other people are less certain in their views. They also consider arguments, but they are not really sure about, and they might change their opinions more often than strong partisans do. So this idea of strong predispositions, strong attitudes, as we say in social psychology, is quite important to take into account, because people with strong attitudes are not very likely to be influenced by news media reports. People that are not that much certain in their opinions, they have opinions, but they're not that much certain in them, more likely to be influenced by mass media reports. Second, politics is dynamic. I tried to point out that in the slide before, and citizens' opinions are dynamic too. That actually means when we look for media effects, and we look for media effects only at one single time point, it might happen that we find no effects at all. But this doesn't necessarily mean that there are no media effects. It might also mean that the media effects occurred at a period of time prior to that. So finding no media effects does not mean there are no media effects. So we have to study media effects over time in order to observe the power of the mass media. I'd like to show you some results of the studies I've done within the NCCR democracy. It's a different methodological approaches, and as you can imagine, if you try to answer the question if the mass media are powerful or not, the answer always depends on your approach and how you study public opinion. So I'd like to give you results of two different studies. First, these are social scientific experiments in which we invite participants, give them a newspaper article to read, and then ask them their opinions. And we try to control everything around that. So we try to simulate the opinion formation process in the laboratory under controlled conditions. The second kind of studies is tracing public opinion in the real world. That is, we ask people in public opinion surveys, you might get phone calls from polling companies, asking about their opinions, we ask them about the media sources they have used, and then we try to look if there is an impact of the news media on public opinion. Now comes the slide where probably It might be difficult to understand everything what I'm saying here, but don't worry. As you know, a good scientific presentation is always 50% of information that everyone will understand. It's 40% of information that other scholars, other scientists will understand, and it's always 10% of information only I will understand. So if you happen to not be quite sure how to understand some information on the following slides, don't worry about that. It might be the information that only I understand and no one else. Okay, I'd like to report about a panel study we did, a public opinion survey we did about the Swiss corporate taxation reform in 2008. It's a two-wave panel survey. That means people were asked at 2 time points, and we asked for their voting intention. Would you vote in favor or not? And we asked, how certain are you in your voting intention? And beside that, we analyzed all media content throughout this campaign. So we knew how was the whole campaign, the whole issue treated in the news media, and we knew what kind of media sources our respondents were exposed to, because we asked them, which newspapers did you read, which television shows did you follow? So we looked at the news media and we tried to extract the dominant framing. So how was the issue treated in the news media? Single respondent, all respondents used in the panel survey. So the basic idea is we have one respondent and we ask this respondent, what kind of newspaper, political information, where do you get your political information from? And the one says, okay, it's 20 minutes. It's a free newspaper we have here in Switzerland. And other people have other newspapers or other sources of information they use. And the idea now in a statistical procedure is to match every person, the attitudes of every person, with the content of the newspapers or media information that these people were most likely exposed to. So we have both kinds of information. We know the person's attitudes, and we know the newspapers or media information the person has used. And we match these 2 kinds of information, and then we can estimate media effects. Hans-Peter Grisi yesterday told us about the problem of selective exposure, and this is, of course, a very important issue. If people only selectively choose this kind of information that matches with their own political views, then we might have a problem in a democracy. Because this actually means if you are left-wing, you only have left-wing information, and if you're right-wing, you only get right-wing information. So how is there a discussion going on in the public? So this might actually be a problem for a democracy, or we might have to discuss about that. What we can see in these data here is that although there are signs for selective exposure, in fact there's also a lot of cross pressures going on. So in fact people are also confronted with political opinions they do not share. So we don't have a selective exposure for everyone. This is not the case for the referendums in Switzerland. People follow media sources, and those media sources report about several sides, and that's why you get confronted with also with political opinions that you probably or possibly do not share. What you see here is the result of a study, and I'd like to make it it's a simplified result, and you see here 3 lines: people who are not very certain in their attitudes, people who are very certain in their attitudes, and people who are somehow certain in their attitudes. And you see here how the extent to which every individual was exposed to a dominant pro-framing, also in favor of the reform, and here the voting decision. And what we see is quite simply that people who are very certain in their views, they are not influenced by media coverage at all. There's no impact. So no matter how strongly those people are exposed to pro-information, their attitudes are not more pro as a result of that. But people who are not really certain about their attitudes, about this issue, they have an opinion, but they're not really sure about that. They are highly influenced by mass media coverage. They are confronted with pro-reform framing over time, and as a result of that, they are more pro the reform over time. Interesting thing about this result, this is an analysis I'm not showing here, is that these effects happen throughout the whole time. So it's not the case that all opinions are formed at the beginning of a campaign or at the end of the campaign. Opinions are formed throughout the whole campaign. And I tried to visualize this with this chart here. As the debate unfolds over time, you have several types of people. You have, for instance, someone who is influenced at the beginning of the campaign by the news media coverage, quite at the beginning. He forms a certain opinion, and you think, okay, this is something I now truly believe, I have formed my opinion about this issue right now, and afterwards there are no media effects for this person or for this group of persons anymore. Other persons come to the campaign and they already have an opinion, a strong opinion about this campaign. So they say, I'm absolutely against this reform. So no matter what is reported in the news media, these people are not influenced by news media coverage. Other people are influenced at the beginning of the campaign, and they get media coverage, and as a result of that they say, oh yes, I'm pro, but nevertheless they do not form certain opinions, strong opinions, and so they are influenced throughout the whole campaign. The attitudes can change throughout the whole campaign as a result of the information they are exposed to in the news media coverage. Let me quickly at the end show you the same result also observed in social science experiments. The same idea with a different method. What we do in those experiments, we expose people, we have randomly assigned people to two groups, a blue group and a red group. One group gets a blue frame, some kind of information, and the other group gets a different frame with other kind of information, and then we measure their attitudes. And what I do to take the whole dynamic perspective into account, I invite those people again after 10 days and then confront them with the opposite framing. So those who receive the blue frame now receive the red frame, and those who receive the red now receive the blue frame, and again the opinions are measured. And to take into account the whole idea of attitude certainty and strong predispositions, we model this whole process by manipulating the attitude certainty with psychological techniques used in the laboratory. So we have one huge group trying to develop uncertain attitudes, and one group trying to form certain attitudes, strong attitudes at the first encounter with those media frames. And of course the idea is that those people who form rather uncertain attitudes in response to those newspaper articles completely can change their opinions. When they get a blue frame, they have a blue opinion. When they get a red frame, they have a red opinion. They completely flip-flop their opinions. Other people who form strong opinions at the beginning of a campaign, simulation of a campaign, once they have a blue opinion, they stay blue no matter which other competing frames are suggested in the news. And this is exactly what has been found. Let me quickly show you this. What you see here is actually the 2 time points, and you see a dependent variable. It's a study about health conditions in Swiss prisons, and the question is, who's to blame for that? Who's responsible for the bad health conditions we have in Swiss prisons? Of course, this is a fictitious issue to model the opinion formation process. And we see that the red line is people who received a frame at first time point saying that society is responsible for that, and the blue line is received an article saying that no, prisoners themselves are responsible for that, and it's a newspaper story based on several facts. And at the first time point you see, okay, those who received the red frame are more likely to say society is to blame, and those who received the blue frame are more likely to say that prisoners themselves are to blame. At second time point, they are confronted with the opposing frame, also with different information, and as a result of that, they completely change their opinions. Now they say, okay, look, when I think about it, well, also prisoners themselves are responsible for this problem. It's not only the society. Now when I have this information, I take this information into account, and I must say, I think these people are to blame as well, and they change their opinions because they were not very certain in the attitudes they have formed. However, when people have high certainty attitudes, when they're really certain, established certain opinions at the first encounter with news frames, these opinions cannot be changed by exposing them to opposite information. They stick to their original opinions. They say, no, I have formed my opinion about this. I have this information in mind. I think society is responsible, and no matter if you have different information here from me, I will stick to my opinion nevertheless. So summing up, I started with the question of manipulating or enlightening public opinion. And I think what we can observe very strong media effects, but only for some people and at some points in time. And this is quite important. And as you also heard from the presentations this morning, there are many factors, many other factors that determine if these media effects are strong or not. For instance, credibility or talking with other people and stuff like that. Hans-Peter Griese yesterday talked about conversion, and he said that 10% of the electorate are actually conversed in their opinions. And now we could argue, how much is it? And I would say 10% is a huge amount of people getting conversed. If 10% of electorate changes his or her opinions, that can be decisive for any referendum. And I would say this is a huge impact. Of course, we could argue about that, but my opinion is this is a huge media impact and a very serious media impact. But only for some people and at some points in time, and this is quite important when we look for media effects. So are these media effects, for some people, a threat to democracy? Is this a problem for democracy? And I would argue, no, this is not really a problem for democracy, because basically what we can observe in our media effect studies here in Switzerland is that these opinions are informed opinions. That means that frames inform opinions or impact opinions by making people aware of some facts that are relevant for an issue at hand. And so people's opinions are based on facts, on substantial information, arguments that are transported through the news, that are suggested by political actors. So these opinions make somehow sense. And it's also good that people are open to these substantive arguments. If people were not open to these substantive arguments, what kind of democracy would we have? If everyone would shut down and not be open to any argument. So people are receptive to those arguments, and I would say this is not a bad thing for democracy. It's not a threat to democracy. And it's also not necessary that citizens need to understand all arguments. They probably won't understand all arguments, but we should keep in mind that those frames that are suggested in the news are, for the broad public, nevertheless quite simple, and they are broken down to some basic arguments, and citizens somehow understand those arguments, or they understand what is relevant to their own lives. They are capable of doing that, and this shapes their opinions. And I don't see a bad thing about that. And finally, themselves, they can decide whether they remain open to persuasion or not. If they are convinced about a position, if they form an opinion in response to news framing, and they're convinced about this opinion, they can say, I'm convinced about this, and they will not be influenced by media coverage anymore. And I guess probably you know many examples from yourself where you say, I'm really convinced about this position, and about this position, you can tell me what you want, you won't change my mind. So it's up to people to decide whether they are satisfied with the arguments that are transported through the news media, whether they remain open to persuasion or not. So ending up this discussion, I would say those effects of news frames, those effects of substantial information conveyed through the mass media is not really a threat to democracy. But there are other threats we could discuss about, other threats that I would say are more serious threats when it comes to a democracy. We have some tendencies in many countries all over the world, to different degrees, of tabloidization, entertainment politics, personalization, celebrity politics. These things have been touched before in the discussions today and yesterday, and there is a tendency of some political candidates to not talk about substantive frames, but just presenting themselves as persons, as people like you and I, and conveying information that's not really relevant in a referendum or with a political decision at hand. It's not really relevant information, it's more or less irrelevant information. This is the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Balkenende, and he did, for instance, he's famous for that. He did a show, or he goes to a show with, it's a youth show about teenagers and problems of teenagers, and he likes to show up there and giving interviews, and he's a completely different audience and a completely different way of transporting his ideas, and these this way works over sympathy. He tries to convey sympathy for himself, and it's not about arguments. Also an example from German elections. For those of you not fluent in German, I might translate that. The election slogan here actually means we have more to offer. Wir haben mehr zu bieten. And it's not about arguments here anymore. There's a completely different way of gathering attention, of also maybe of transporting sympathy, of getting people to vote for something, of getting people to be attracted to something. Although I must say, if I show this picture to my students, some come to me and say, don't show that to me, I feel offended. I feel offended by these pictures. By this picture, others come to me and say, can I have a copy of that? I like it very much. Other threats, serious threats, I would say, is what we can also observe in many democracies, is a rising distrust in the mainstream news media. And author Lupia told us this morning that credibility is quite important for persuasion. And if people do not trust the mainstream news media or do not trust media at all, how can we reach citizens in a democracy with the arguments that citizens might want to consider at a debate that's really important for the future of a country? So if people don't trust the news media, this is a problem in a democracy, and there are some reasons for concern here, because we have a rising distrust in many countries, also in the United States, and reasons for that are, of course, several reasons for that. Some reasons that are suggested are a lower news quality because of economic constraints we can observe in many journalistic organizations, and also misinformation at some debates where and people are not as stupid as we often think they are. At least that's my opinion. And people, they remember that. They will remember that, for instance, when we're talking about, or let me bring the example that is quite famous here in Europe, the weapons of mass destruction when it comes to the war in Iraq. People can remember that, and they know this was some kind of misinformation. The media just transported this information, and now we know it was not true, and this might lead to rising levels of distrust. Finally, we also talked about the media logic, mediatization yesterday. That means that the media political actors adopt strategies by the news media and try to feed the hunger by news media, and they do that by focusing on conflicts, on negative information, and the news media increasingly imports about this negative information. They focus on conflicts, scandals, negative behavior, attack journalism, and what we have as a result, there are many studies showing that the more negative news media are, the more distrust people have in the whole realm of politics at several levels. And this is a threat, because if people distrust politics and distrust the state level, we have to discuss about how we can reach people in a democracy. My last slide, something that's my personal stance on this issue. This is a question: do we have some kind of vicious cycle of mediatization? Is this possibly the future when we are talking about political communication? And this is something I also would like to discuss with you, that we have journalists that say, based on commercial pressure, and based on what citizens want, or what we believe that citizens want, journalists more and more tend to trivialize political content. They focus on conflict, they focus on entertainment, so they take the substance out of a political discussion with the argument we have to earn money, and this is what people actually want. They don't want these boring discussions, they want to be entertained. As a result of that, they have more articles with less substance, and political actors observe that and think, okay, apparently this is what the news media wants. And this is the whole idea of mediatization, by the way. The news media wants conflict. The news media wants entertainment politics. So we give them what they want. We behave in a way that they get entertainment politics, they get conflict, so we are negative. So we act in accordance with our expectations of what the news media expects from us. This is the idea of mediatization. And so we have some kind of cycle going on. And my question is it really true that the public really wants that? Is it really true that the public wants only entertainment politics, that the public is not interested in substantive arguments? And I would say that at some point in this discussion, we underestimate the capabilities of the public. And we see in many instances here in Europe that if the public has an issue that really touches them, and they are really capable of understanding political arguments, and they are also ready to fight for their views, to discuss about their views, and to participate in politics. Thanks very much.
So, thanks, Jörg Matthes, for his interesting presentation about the influence of mass media. The floor is now open for questions.
So you stated that media has influence on the people. This is something that we can see. Media increase their power and price if they can demonstrate influence on the people, and this is how they attract the potential sponsors. I have a question. What is your opinion? Which kind of people media would like to have in democratic society? Easy to influence or hard to influence?
Yeah, actually both. Of course, we need a certain degree of interest that people have in politics. So we must be able to reach people somehow. But also, you will have. We want to have people in a democracy that are really focused on what they are doing. They have strong predispositions and people that cannot be influenced. And I rather like to see this as a flexible process. I think that citizens are not capable of being highly involved in politics all the time. But at some instances, people can be very involved and can be have very strong opinions on politics. And at these times, they are maybe not so easy to influence. On the other hand, you need some kind of degree of openness. And this is something we can observe here in our media effect studies, that still a large amount of electorate is open to substantial arguments. And this is, I would also say, this is quite important for a democracy, that people are receptive to political arguments that are transported in the news media. If no one wants to listen to those arguments, or if everyone has already made up his own mind, if people are not open to opposing views, then we could question the idea of democracy. So my answer to your question is basically, I wish to have both. And I think this will also change over time. At some points, people are open. At some points, they are not. And this is perfectly fine with me. Okay. Pardon?
I understand what is in democracy, what we want to receive in democracy. But what is your opinion that media really want?
What the media really wants?
Yeah. Which kind of people?
The media wants to sell copies, and the media wants to make a commercial profit. That's most important for them. I think they are not as interested in persuasion as political actors are. So it's hard for me to tell what they really want. They want to reach the public, and what they want to touch the values that are important to the public, because over those values that are touched, they can get people to pay for media information. But let me point to a very interesting result we could observe also in Switzerland. The media have a tendency to be more trivial because they say the public wants that. But in fact, when you ask the public in our surveys, they say, no, this is not credible information. This is not really credible information. This is tabloid information. So the people are very well equipped to judge this information, and they can be very skeptical about that. So if the strategy of the news media is to focus on trivial information, this might be positive for some people who want entertainment, but others who want substantive information will have a rising distrust, and this might be a problem for democracy. So as you see, a quite complicated issue.
Okay. We had a second question there.
So my question concerns one of the first slides you showed. And on this slide you raised the question, namely the question, what kind of citizens do we want in a democracy? Now my question is, who is the we in the question? What kind of citizens do we want? When listening to your talk, I had some doubts. Who could be meant? You often spoke of a we, and it was clear to me that it was the community of the scientists in the field of politology. But is it this we you were addressing in the question, or is it another we? In the end of your talk, you spoke about the public. Is it the we of the public, or is it even a third or other we's? So this is the question.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. This is a very good question, and I must say that as a scientific scholar, I don't mean the we of scientists, as we basically are, or in our role, or I see my role, are neutral observers. I observe media effects, and I try to observe them in a neutral manner, and the results should not be shaped by my feelings of what we want in a democracy. I just report the results, and I can give some hints of how we could discuss that in a scientific or in a public setting. So I'm quite neutral on that. As a scientist, I want to know how it is, but I don't want to change a democracy. So what I basically mean is probably the perspective of those who try to lead the country, those who try to attract people to participate in a democracy, so the political system as such. And I think this is a perspective, although those who are in favor of the whole idea of democracy also have to look for the potential threats to a democracy, because they need the democracy to move the country forward. That's what politicians need to do. They need to have progress, and they need to do it by means of a democracy. So they need to be concerned about that, and the we I suggested on the second slide is probably what they would expect in a democracy of the public to behave.
Okay, we had a third question there.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question that's simultaneously pessimistic and technical, so I apologize in advance for that. But you have, in your presentation, you say basically long-term trends in changes in society and the media are quite negative in terms of public opinion, but for short-term effects on a single issue, the media is capable of influencing in a positive fashion undecided voters, flip-floppers if you want. But the way I read your data, actually, and I'm very astonished of that, but shows that people who say are presented with opinion A to start with, and then are presented with opinion B, end up with an opinion that's exactly the same as if they were only presented with opinion B. Which basically means that they completely forgot the first argument they've received. They don't make a sort of mix of the various opinions they've received. They just follow whatever latest argument they've heard. So how you can make... I don't see that as a positive result. And when you say that the voters take in the decision to make a reasonable opinion, I don't understand your data as such. Huh? Mm-hmm. Thanks for answering that.
Thanks very much for this interesting question. I think my point is that nevertheless, people themselves are free to decide whether they remain open to persuasion or not. So if I confront what I did in the laboratory, of course, I manipulated this opinion formation process. But in the real world, if you are confronted with information in the news and you are convinced by those arguments, if those arguments deem strong to you, you will form a strong opinion. And if you are interested in this issue and have all arguments at hand, you can form a strong opinion, and then in the course of the campaign, you will not be influenced anymore because of this choice, because of your motivation, because of your elaboration of the information you choose to conduct at this certain point in time. Others don't really care about that, and they remain open. And I think this is a quite rational thing to do. If we discuss about a policy issue that's unfamiliar, you say, wow, your perspective is interesting. It's interesting, yeah. I see your arguments, but you remain somehow unconvinced. And the most rational thing to do is not to form a strong opinion, but to wait for other possible arguments that might come. And if those other arguments convince you, you can form a strong opinion or remain open. And of course, then you have some point in a campaign where we have to discuss about when only one particular side is favored in the news, when you have a strong news bias. That would actually mean that people would end up with this opinion that is strongly favored in the news. So if you only have one frame throughout the whole campaign, for instance, then we would have to discuss about news bias. And there are some scholars that say this is also potentially problematic for a democracy because the second side is completely missing. Here people are manipulated because they do not have the chance to see both sides of the argument. When you have both sides of an issue, and in our media system, when you look at the media coverage, in Switzerland at least, this is for most issues the case. People are well informed, and the frames, there are several frames transported to the media. Not all frames, of course, but the citizens have the possibility to get into contact with competing different arguments. And for me, this is, I would say, this is not a threat to democracy. This is a normal opinion formation process. And finally, it's up to the citizens themselves to remain open or not.
Next question.
I follow with growing unease the discussion. And I'm not asking a question, I'm making a comment directed towards the speaker and the audience at the same time. We treat the so-called citizen, also called voter, as if he was a substrate for enzymes like called politicians or media to be chewed upon until he is in frame. None of this is true. Every voter and every citizen is a human being and thus has the duty, obligation and capacity to form an opinion. And I think that this was perfectly well described by a fellow in Geneva who said, "L'homme n'est qu'un roseau, mais c'est un roseau pensant."
Yeah, it just comes to my mind, an English colleague, he wrote an article in the same sense, The Invisible Stakeholder and the Warm Glow of the Public Opinion. This is what the title maybe is somewhere. Okay.
I'm not a specialist in this field, but I have a question. Has there any time a study been made that sort of looks at the adverse effect of political, presentations in TV? Because what I have a bit the impression in Switzerland that, especially the mass media, they are let's take this minaret example again. They were all against the initiative, so pro that you could still build it. And I sort of have a certain feeling that was a reason why many people actually voted for the initiative, wrongfully, okay, but they still did it because they sort of have a mistrust of this media system, or this, they call it the media political caste or whatever, and they actually vote against it. I think we see the similar thing in the States with this Tea Party campaign or so. It's also sort of an adverse effect. So even if the media are very favorable and the frames are in a majority, let's say for a reasonable solution, that in a way the voters just do the opposite, just as a protest.
Yeah, thanks very much. First of all, a comment to your honorable position. It's very honorable to have this position, and I think we all would perfectly agree with that we are talking about human beings and everyone is obliged to participate in a society. But we are scientists, what we do, we observe how people follow their obligation and what they do. And this is also completely reasonable, and I think there's no question about that this is possible and important, because we have to understand how society works, we have to understand how people work, how people behave in a democracy, and I see there's nothing wrong with that. Answering your question, I don't have any data on that, but the argument you put forward makes some sense and is quite interesting and convincing at the same time. When you look also at Germany, the discussion you have about the book by Sarrazin, for instance, who made a book wrote a book about problems of Germany and immigration, and arguing that we have a huge problem with this issue here, and the whole media slaughters this book. Everyone is completely against this book, but it's one of the best-selling books nowadays you have. It's sold 1 million copies. So we have the same discussion there. So apparently there is a need, and there is something in citizens. And this also brings me not to underestimate the citizens. We always tend to underestimate citizens as human beings. That there's citizens. There is some kind of tendency within citizens or that they have opinions where they know that these opinions are not conveyed or transported to the news media, that they know that the news media would not support these opinions, and they vote or they give their opinions at the ballot or by buying this book, and I think this makes some sense. I don't have any data on that. It would be a perfectly interesting study to have. If I had such a study, I would be perfectly happy. Thank you.
I think we have one last question.
You showed us at the end this, what I call vicious circle of the tabloid. Do you think, if you talk and you take back the argument of underestimating the citizen, if you talk to young people, they read 20 minutes for maybe 10 minutes, or go through in the train, throw it away. And when you start to discuss seriously with them, you see that they have a completely different reaction and information. And you ask them, where did you get your information? And they say, not from the mass media. I I went myself, I surfed on the internet, I looked at different sites, and this is the basis of my information. So do you think at a given time, the mass media will realize that they have a problem there?
This is a, thanks very much. This is a very pressing question and a huge debate we have in the field right now, and it's also a very complicated debate. I completely agree with what you say, that young voters do not follow the mainstream news media as most of us probably do, or most of us in our generations probably do, and they have completely different ways of getting exposed to information about politics, and they might also prefer different information than older people or other cohorts, other ages do. But what is the consequence of that? One consequence of the news media, okay, we have to find different ways of attracting those people, getting those people interested in the political realm. This is one strategy. So that would actually mean providing more entertainment, or providing more information that is relevant to the values of young people. It's relevant for their lives. Trying to be more modern in our ways we communicate. That also means shorter communication, probably more electronic communication, more mobile communication, modern forms of communication, and this makes perfect sense, and I think the news media has to react on that. But on the other hand, there is the risk that when you go only to very limited chunks of information, you also have other readers, and that's basically the older generations, and if they are confronted with this rising tabloidization, which we can observe in the news, they say this is uncredible information, but actually these people are the people that pay for media content. And my thesis is, I have some data on that, but my thesis is that it would be, I would warn against underestimating the citizens as such. I think there are many people, and there's a huge amount of citizens that will react in negative ways if the news media decide to go only tabloid, and then you have some kind of cycle going on. Because you do not know what would have happened if it would have made other decisions. And the news media is probably contributing to its own decline if they are focusing only on superficial politics, entertainment politics, because they lose those people that actually like to pay for news media. And this is not all people. This is, you might say this is a political elite, but this political elite is willing to pay for this information. And this is the way news media can finance itself, by having people paying for information. And if you only go for trivial entertainment information, you might have a short-term effect. In the short term, this might be good, and you might have more readers, and you might reach people. But in the long run, you might risk that you earn distrust and withdrawal from people who are interested in substantive information. And there is an amount of people, especially here in Switzerland and in Europe, who are interested in substantive information about politics and want to follow politics. And what we don't want, or what journalists apparently don't want or should not want, is to lose these folks because they pay for it. So I would warn against that. I only have partial proof for my thesis. It's a thesis we could discuss, maybe also in the break. But I think it's important to have this position.